All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to explore the fascinating and honestly sometimes invisible forces that hold humanity together, especially during those times when the world feels like it's completely falling apart. We're going to unpack the history of sociology, which is basically a discipline entirely dedicated to understanding the hidden threads that connect us all. So are you shaping society, or is society actually shaping you? That one single, really provocative question is the beating heart of sociology. And what's absolutely crucial to understand here is that this field didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was born out of the sheer, massive chaos of the French and Industrial Revolutions. Just imagine living through a time when the traditional order, the monarchy, the slow pace of rural life, was completely upended in just a few decades. Massive factories were replacing family farms almost overnight. Early thinkers were forced to look around and ask, okay, how do we actually maintain order when literally everything we know is changing? To make sense of all this history, we'll quickly map our journey. We'll be looking at 1. The birth of sociology, 2. The classical founders, 3. The great debate of holism versus individualism, 4. Modern sociological theories, and 5. The future of society. Starting off with Section 1, the birth of sociology and making sense of all that chaos. You see, the disruption of the old traditional order forced early thinkers to treat society not as some given fact of nature, but as a really complex puzzle that needed solving. This journey really kicked off in the 18th century. We moved from what was basically spontaneous sociology, broad philosophical musings about human progress, into something way more structured. Thinkers like Auguste Comte essentially wrote the birth certificate for sociology, while Alexis de Tocqueville was busy analyzing the sudden rise of democracy. But it was the 19th century, with the harsh, brutal realities of the Industrial Revolution, that forced the field to truly evolve. By the 20th century, sociologists realized that broad philosophies just weren't cutting it anymore. They needed rigorous, empirical science. They started using statistical methods and actual field observations to measure what was going on in the modern world. Moving right along to Section 2, the classical founders. These are the real architects of sociological thought. What's super interesting here is that the actual foundation of sociology was built by two major rivals who were looking at the exact same world from completely different angles. On the left, representing the French school, we have Émile Durkheim, and on the right, representing the German school, we have Max Weber. Think of it like a camera lens. Durkheim looking through a massive telescope at the overarching giant structures of society, insisting that sociology has to be as objective as physics or biology. Weber, on the other hand, totally flips the script. He pulls out a microscope to look at the individual's daily subjective choices, arguing that we absolutely have to understand the specific meaning everyday people attach to their actions. Which brings us to Section 3, holism versus individualism. This is the core conflict. So here we arrive at the great debate of classical sociology. And honestly, this isn't just some dusty academic squabble. It fundamentally changes how you might view your own life. Durkheim championed holism through this concept he called the social fact. He argued that we are governed by ways of acting and thinking that are entirely external to us, yet they possess a very real, coercive power over us. Think about waiting in a line, or even the clothes you decided to put on today. You probably feel like you made a purely independent, free choice, right? But Durkheim would argue that invisible, heavy social structures practically forced you to behave in that specific way. Because if you just step out of line, the social pushback is immediate. You can see how this works conceptually. Society is pushing inward on the subject. That is holism in a nutshell. It's the idea that the whole of society is so much greater and much more powerful than the sum of its parts. It's almost like society is a living, breathing organism, and we are just the tiny cells inside it, constantly being molded and shaped by the needs of the larger system just to maintain equilibrium. But then you have Max Weber, who totally opposed that heavy top-down view. He defined social action as behavior that is driven by individual subjective meaning. For Weber, you are absolutely not a puppet of societal structures. When you take an action, you do it with intention, and you orient that action toward other people. If we really want to understand society, Weber argued we have to start from the ground up by understanding the individual. So, for example, choosing a career based on your own personal passion rather than just blindly following a family tradition, well, that's a social action driven by your own subjective meaning. This ground-up approach is what's known as atomism, or methodological individualism. It suggests that society isn't some looming dark cloud dictating our moves. Instead, it's really just the end product of countless tiny atomic interactions between everyday people. We literally build the society through our continuous daily interactions. Now, we absolutely can't skip over Karl Marx here, who introduced a sociology of change and conflict. Marx added a really dynamic twist to this whole era by framing society not just as stable structures, and not just as subjective actions, but as an ongoing historical conflict over resources and power, specifically between classes. Think about a labor strike. This introduces the idea that contradiction and struggle are actually the core engines driving society forward. All right, into section 4, modern sociological theories, the synthesis. If the classical era of sociology was defined by these strict either-or debates, society versus the individual, modern sociology is all about the synthesis. Thinkers in the 20th century realized that looking exclusively through a telescope or a microscope just wasn't enough. You kind of need both. On one end, you have American functionalism with folks like Parsons and Merton, who took Durkheim's macro view and saw society as a complex system striving for balance. Then, you've got the Chicago School and interactionism with Becker and Goffman. They took Weber's microview and looked at everyday life almost like a giant theatrical stage play, where we are all just actors performing our roles. But the real modern synthesis, the sweet spot, happens with constructivism. French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu's constructivism is a total game changer here. He looked back at that old holism versus individualism debate and essentially said, hey, you're both right and you're both wrong. Bourdieu acts as a bridge. He argued that, yes, individuals are heavily shaped by overarching social structures. We inherit cultural capital, wealth, and certain mindsets. But at the exact same time, through our everyday actions and choices, we continuously recreate, reinforce, or sometimes even alter those very structures. So we are structured by society, but we also structure society right back. A great way to think about this is language. You are forced to use the grammar you inherit from society. But through your daily conversations, you invent slang and actively change the language itself over time. Let's head into our final section, Section 5, the future of society, looking at modernity and beyond. So we've seen how classical thinkers defined the rules, and modern thinkers synthesize them. But how does any of this apply to the crazy, unprecedented challenges of the 21st century? Well, today's sociologists are analyzing what they call a liquid society. The solid institutions of the past, like staying at one company for 40 years, are melting away into things like the gig economy. Thinkers like Anthony Giddens and François Dubé point to the rise of the reflexive individual. Because the old, rigid rules are gone, you and I are basically forced to constantly reflect on and actively construct our own unique identities. And it goes even further. The very concept of what makes up society is radically expanding. With actor network theory, sociologists are now looking at how technology, the internet, and even the natural environment interact with us as active participants in our social networks. And that brings us to a really mind-bending realization, perfectly captured by Bruno Latour. The rigid boundary between human society and the natural earth, it's pretty much gone. They are fundamentally interwoven. As climate change and global tech networks completely redefine our reality, sociology is going to have to rethink everything. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought to take away from today's explainer. If our social systems, our technologies, and the physical earth itself are now completely tangled up together, how will we shape the society of tomorrow? Or rather, how will it shape us? Just something to think about the next time you make a perfectly individual choice.